Thanks so much for inviting me to the Social Bridges. I'm super excited. I'm going to have to rewatch some of the stuff, especially in the morning because of the time difference. So I'm sorry I missed and can't link to the talks that went just before me. Another disclaimer is that there's just because schools recently just closed here, so there's a bunch of kids coming in and there might be some ruffle in the background. That's just, I guess, the nature of our situation right now. So I apologize if that distracts me or you at any moment. In any event, so these, let me see if this is advancing. Yeah, so these are scenes from what seems like a complete different universe. But still, though, I think it's probably true for most, if not all of us, that we see people face to face, probably in person, on a daily basis. And it's also still true that, and maybe even more true, because we can't really do a lot of in-person research, that as researchers, we know very little about how the human brain supports everyday social communication. Let alone outside of the laboratory environment. And this is, of course, true for both in-person and naturalistic virtual communication, right? So it raises, the recent situation has raised a lot of questions, obviously, about what is natural in the face-to-face interactions and what predicts successful communication through different means of communication. And this is probably in part because for decades, of course, we've been using a laboratory model of human cognition for good reason. You can run controlled experiments in quiet environments, et cetera. But we've also been assuming sort of that the same perceptual mechanisms apply to the lab as they do to these real world situations without often actually testing whether this is true. So as we know, the recent decade has seen effort in trying to start testing this laboratory model in real world situations. And in a recent paper, and many others have done the same, have proposed that this relationship between real world and lab research should be one of exploration and confirmation, right? Where they enter in dialogue with each other. And so to make such a real world neuroscience approach possible, I collaborate with artists, scientists, and educators in a series of hyperscanning projects. And in a lot of our projects, we use Synchrony neurofeedback. So now, almost 10 years ago, my friend and collaborator, Matthias Oosterijk, who's an interactive media artist, and I developed software setup with the Emotive headset, portable consumer-grade EEG headset that allowed us to record EEG from multiple people at the same time, and then we translate the extent to which brain activity becomes coupled into different types of output. So here, for example, you see two heads merging in and out of each other as a function of how correlated the activity is between the two people. So this is a neurofeedback game where dyads can try to sync up their brainwaves, and then after 2 or 3 minutes, depending on when you set the timer, they can compare their sync score to people that went before them or after them, or they can try out different strategies to synchronize, kind of create their own conditions, so to speak. And so we're now streamlining this protocol, the software for public use in the Rhythms of Relating project, which should, it's in progress right now, but should be available soon. And this game and our other projects have proven pretty valuable for scientific outreach in science museums and festivals. Throughout the years, we've participated in the World Science Festival. We've done this at various Lowlands, American Museum of Natural History, et cetera. And it's also then enabled us, without much risk, so to speak, to test the viability of collecting data under more naturalistic circumstances. Like, can you actually get usable data out of this kind of situation, right? So I'm going to show you a couple of other projects that have the similar kind of approach, just to illustrate how, obviously, different ways in which you can visualize or sonify or, translate synchrony into something tangible. So in a compatibility eraser, for example, which is the brainchild of Lauren Silbert, who worked with Ur Hassan, synchrony is translated into the motor speed of a card that moves faster as synchrony increases and then slows down as it decreases. So here synchrony metaphorically fuels the compatibility eraser, right? And as you can imagine, it's really easy to get people to participate in these kinds of installations, but you can also see that they treat it as an amusement ride, right? So they're like moving their heads, they're laughing, et cetera, right? And so that, for anybody who's worked with EG, knows that it means that the data that is rendered here is fairly unusable. So in the mutual wave machine, we instead ask people to engage in face-to-face interaction for 10 minutes inside intimate capsule, which invites a more solemn approach to the interaction, so to speak. And people are immersed in light patterns that reflects their brain synchrony. So more light, alludes to the exhilaration of being able to connect to someone. And then it like strays into darkness and in the lack of synchrony. And so that kind of alludes to the fact that we, the frustration of and the loneliness of trying to connect somebody but failing, right? That is very much a part of all our research as well. And so in some versions of the installation, people also see a real-time video image of themselves emerge behind the person that they're sitting opposite to. And that alludes to questions of what it really means to synchronize to others. Are you really connecting with the other person, seeing the other person, so to speak? Or are you actually projecting a mirror image of yourself onto the other, like looking for reflections, basically? So over 5,000 participants or so have participated in a mutual wave machine. And today I'm going to just show you some data that was recently published from the most controlled and well and comprehensive data set from the Benaki Museum in Greece that was collected in 2016. And so here, half of the participants were explicitly told that more light means more brain synchrony, and half of the people were not. So these were blissfully naive participants who just walk into the museum, stand in line for an installation without actually really informing themselves what it's about, which is actually very common. I, go into theater and museums like that often also myself. And so that's like a bug that you can use as a feature in this kind of situations to very naturally create these two groups of people. And what we hypothesize is that this difference, like knowing that what the installation is supposed to do has to do something with the way you connect, actually makes people want to connect further, focus on the social interaction, and that would like increase their synchrony. And we also ask people questions about their social closeness, personality traits, and mental states. And obviously, we're dealing with less than suboptimal recording conditions, especially compared to the lab environment. And so even though that is definitely still true for the results, also we try to offset this both by collecting data from tons and tons of people, which also then allowed us to be very stringent and throw away tons and tons of data sets that didn't meet our criterion. And worked with Yoros Michalareas from Max Planck Institute in Frankfurt. And we used the synchrony metrics that are known to remove the common noise. So any kind of environmental noise would not factor into our synchrony metrics as much. So we find, for example, that social closeness predicts synchrony. So those pairs who reported higher social closeness also showed higher overall synchrony. We've seen the same for personality traits, especially, and this is a finding that we see consistently in our studies, is that personal distress fairly robustly predicts synchrony, where those people with low personal distress show more synchrony, possibly because they're less self-oriented. And then for mental states and contexts, we looked at changes over time, and we find that those pairs who remained more focused showed more synchrony in the second half of the experiment. And that the same is true for only the neurofeedback group. So those people who were really, who were told explicitly over and over again that what they were experiencing had something to do with them being on the same wavelength, so to speak. All of these projects also have a scientific and an artistic component, but they also naturally come with an educational side, right? There's a setup phase where you can show participants, people from the general public who might not always themselves come to the lab. You can show them their brainwaves in real time. You can teach people all sorts of things in a very intuitive way, like this is maybe not a mind reading device. And we can't really use your EEG synchrony to give you advice about whether you should get married or divorced, right? Like the reverse inference is a very, people want this, but it's a challenge and a good challenge, I think, for us as scientists and educators to try to, still give people the feeling that they're experiencing in something valuable while not quote unquote lying to them about what you're doing can tell them, right? So we've expanded this approach beyond dyads to groups and also beyond the laboratory walls into the classroom, where we used the classroom as our real world lab because we're interested in teaching. And I think Ido Davidescu, who's coming after me, is going to talk much more about that side of our line of work. But it's also a very highly social environment, so that's great. And I'm sure you will fondly or not remember the social aspects of being in a high school classroom. And it also has some natural similarities to the lab, right? So classes are typically governed by a sequence of predetermined activities. And students are also used to being told to sit still and shut up, which is great for EEG data collection. So concretely, we partnered with Trevor Dave's school, a high school in Manhattan. And then at the beginning of the school year, students received a crash course in neuroscience. They learned how to use EEG headsets. They helped with the design where possible. And so this had advantages for us as well. They could assist in the setup. We had very limited time, so that was great. And they also felt ownership over the project, right? Like they were the best subjects we've ever had because they felt like they were themselves, doing their own study. And then in the second part of the year, students carried out their own research projects under the guidance of Ido and a team. And I don't know if he's going to talk maybe more also about like some of the educational efforts that we have. In total, we collected this data from 2 schools and 12 students and a teacher in each school. And we repeated data collection throughout the semester. So we came in multiple times using the same protocol of instructional activities. And in the first school, also some baseline conditions like facing the wall, ERP controls. Actually, the facing the walls in both schools. And then we quantified brain-to-brain synchrony, in this case, as coherence between pairs of students during different teaching activities, and then correlated that with factors relating to classroom engagement and social dynamics. So for example, we asked kids how much they enjoyed each class activity, and then unsurprisingly, we find that they're into watching videos and group discussions, but they're not so into, the very classic old school teaching way that really doesn't really happen anymore, at least in American classrooms as much, where teachers just read from their notes. And what is more interesting for us is, in fact, is that we find that this pattern is replicated in the neural synchrony. So kids are more synchronized with each other during videos than during lectures consistently. We also find that the extent that the student synchrony with the rest of the group was correlated with how much they liked the teacher. And so that's both the case for student-to-student synchrony and student-to-teacher synchrony, with how focused they felt on a given day, with their social personality, how much they like being in a group, and again, with their personal distress, right? So as in a mutual wave machine, we again see a negative correlation with personal distress, in the sense that those people who are less personal distress show more synchrony. So we find that class appreciation, teacher likability, focus, social closeness, empathy, and group affinity also all predict brain synchrony. But we still owe mechanistic explanation as to how these forms of engagement all might modulate neural synchrony. It would be great if there were some overarching, or maybe better if there were different, metrics or things that together predict our metric. And we think in this case that shared attention is a good candidate. However, of course, shared attention is a fairly broad construct, right? So to really get working hypothesis going, you might want to unpack the social situation a little bit further. And so one way to think about this is to really like go back to what the situations are like. So each person comes to a social interaction with their own personality traits, neural architecture, mental states, and priors about the situation. And then the similarity with others in each of these, we know can already predict interbrain sync layer coupling, even in the absence of any social communication, right? We know this from resting state studies in fMRI, for example. And we also know that from lab studies that the same is true for external stimuli ranging from tones to movement, right? Like our entrainment to a stimulus predicts our synchrony with each other very naturally. And so maybe for more relevant for our purposes is how social behavior then, which can help establish a common ground, can also affect synchrony and possibly indirectly or directly social closeness, right? In like what mediates what in these contexts. So now you can study each of these components separately and ask whether they might independently predict synchrony. So to give an example, in our school data, the teacher is an exogenous stimulus with temporal structure. And if kids aren't engaged, there's no neural entrainment with the teacher's speech. So they're also, like there's no reason for their brain activity to be similar. And thereby, as kind of collateral damage, so to speak, there's also not going to be any asynchrony between the kids. In the teacher's dream world, perhaps all the kids are super engaged and their brain waves are super locked to their speech. But we know that, and they're thereby also in perfect, harmony with each other, or synchronized with each other. But in the real world, obviously, there's individual variation, right? So some kids are going to be more engaged than others. And so that might predict some of the variation that we see as a function of individual differences in focus, personality, and engagement. So different social situations then allow us to test these different boxes, perhaps, of the schematic, ranging from different classroom situations or the mutual wave machine, team interactions. We recently done a study with Diego Reinero, for example, but we also study psychotherapy and adult-child interactions in low SES and bilingual families, as well as autism spectrum disorder. So for example, together with the Sackler Institute and with Northwestern University, we've explored how social situations in ASD can affect synchrony. We record EEG and video from adult-child interactions, comparing kids with ASD to typically developing children, but also varying things about the context of the interaction, right? Like we compare caregiver-child interactions to clinician-child interactions while they're engaging with an object or while there's social engagement and there's no toy present. So that's on the bottom, you can see an example of these. And so we see that both eye gaze and interbrain synchrony increases for social engagement compared to object engagement. So you remove the toy, there's more synchrony. And this increase is stronger for a caregiver, right? So a difference between the caregiver and a clinician is most visible in a social interaction. And this difference is stronger for typically developing kids than for kids with ASD. So the effect of removing the object from the scene is stronger for typically developing kids. And this is preliminary data, I have to emphasize. And so what this means is that studying the social disorder in a social context, it matters who you talk to. And it's not just for disorders, obviously, it's also for us, for real world situations. So like see, like typically developing kids show these same effects. It matters who you talk to, and matters what you do, and it matters who you are, right? And so to think about the latter, it's very only sensible that the neural architecture will also influence synchrony indirectly, right? So if we're doing interbrain coupling, often we tend to only report on the synchrony effects and forget about the like possible individual variation or differences, or think about how these might affect the brain. But I know that there's been talks that I need to watch again about these kinds of differences. So people are carefully thinking about this for sure. So in our case, to go back to the neurofeedback that we're doing, so one natural next step is to try to think about how maybe neurofeedback can help improve social communication. And so there's, basically two strains. Like, can we find the magical metric of synchrony that make people intuitive, that's intuitive enough to people to be like, oh, this is kind of what I need to do to synchronize and therefore improve my communication. But also we've seen that just the mere presence of this kind of environment helps people focus on the social interaction. And so for autism spectrum disorder, for example, we know that there are, more possibly more engaged through computer-based interventions than face-to-face interventions. So maybe this is one thing that they would think is fun to help them with social interaction. We've also developed group-based neurofeedback installations. So here you can see a social network that is kind of, forming and deforming in time. And we've used this mostly in artistic context, but it also helps us to really think about, through visualization, really think about, okay, what are we actually measuring in these group interactions? Like, what does similarity mean, right? Like, if you see this orange hub, is that the person who's the leader of the team, or is he really just the common denominator, right? And do you really kind of want to be the pink one on the side, like the one who's the outlier, and maybe at some point, being the leader or the diverger? So like, that's one of the ways in which we're trying to, like, especially engage the general public in helping us think through some of the ideas. We've developed installations around group synchrony where people can play around with their soundscape. So there's sound to this, but that's like very disturbing for talking. And they can play around with, creating, drawing their social network on the floor, so to speak. And we've also started working with dance companies around thinking through synchrony and drawing, for example, a taxonomy of synchrony. So our collaboration here with ICK Amsterdam culminated in a research performance experiment, so to speak, at the Ballet National de Marseille last year, where two dancers, and here you do hear the sound, where performed an audio-visual dialogue with their own motion synchrony. And you can see the visuals are pulled together, and that's as a function of brain synchrony in the audience. So they're dancing with their own bodies and with the audience synchrony. One very useful side of the collaborations with the dancers has also been to try to together come up with a taxonomy or a vocabulary around synchrony from people who are very professional joint action people, and the ways that we think about it in our sciences. So establishing forms of synchrony, especially the notion of simultaneity versus togetherness, which is very intuitive, like doing something together or at the same time. But it's actually really hard for dancers to do this on cue. Now do something together, or now do something simultaneous. Now do something together, but not at the same time. It's actually really difficult. And we're also often, I think, in our metrics or thinking about like ways to measure synchrony, struggling with ways to distinguish togetherness from simultaneity, for example. Synchrony units, what are you actually synchronizing with? Is it the music? Is it the other body? And vehicles, anticipation and resonant, closeness, distance, tuning, feedback, shared attention. And then we can ask whether these constructs might map onto different types of interbrain synchrony or different metrics. And so to just give an example, in the mutual wave machine, we're finding a systematic pattern where behavior and personality predicts projected power correlations around 6 or 7 hertz, and imaginary coherence around 20 hertz. And the two are also related. So those pairs who are more synchronized in lower frequencies are also more synchronized in imaginary coherence. So this pattern can be explained within this shared attention fairly straightforwardly, I think, where if you're in an interaction with somebody, you're never going to be fully on like high attention mode for the entire duration of an interaction, right? Like it fluctuates. You go in and out of paying full attention. And that's also true for the person you are interacting with. So then it kind of follows that the more these cycles co-occur, the higher your low frequency power correlations are going to be. And therefore, there's also possibly more windows of opportunity, so to speak, to create shared intent internal models or to engage in joint action, which might cause increase in synchrony in the higher frequencies. So these and other metrics are now available to test in HiPipe, which is the hyperscanning Python pipeline, which is developed under the supervision of Guillaume Dumas, kind of the king, I think, of our field, and spearheaded by the heroic efforts of Anaël and Florence and Phoebe. And I had the honor to be able to watch along and ride along on this. The pipeline allows you to preprocess your data. It's not necessary. You can also pull preprocessed data into the pipeline, computes different kinds of intra and interbrain connectivity metrics, runs statistics, and visualize results. And this is a joint effort with, well, you guys also, if you want. We invite your input. It's a public effort. Anyway, so this, speaking of public efforts or group efforts, community efforts, and these are just some of the faces of the fantastic people that I've had the honor to work with over the years and be inspired by. So any good ideas are theirs, and any, silly things or dumb things I said are entirely my own, so to speak. All right, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And there was absolutely nothing that you said that wasn't incredibly inspiring and interesting. And as an artist, I have to say, I'm blown away with the way you've managed to put these two worlds together. I am in awe. So thank you very much for what was just an incredibly elegant and eloquent way of leading us through the way you've managed to make much more ecological models of group coordination. And I think the way you transition from the diet into the group is just incredibly smooth. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
I do have one quick question, which, obviously the benefit of some of the installations that you presented is their ecological validity. But I do have a question about this feedback idea, right? So in some of our sensory synchronization tasks, we play around with whether or not people have feedback. And it sort of relates to the talk I gave earlier, which I know you didn't get to see.
Yeah, I will though.
Yeah. The idea is that it gives you more access, say, so to speak, to not only your self-related actions, but also the composite of your and other actions. So it really boosts that self and other content, which we don't necessarily always have, right? So it's ecological in some ways, but in others, I wonder whether, and maybe this is why it's so pertinent for the work with autism spectrum disorder, is that, you maybe are boosting signals that are not otherwise there. But I'd love to hear more about what you think about this, what this feedback is doing.
Yeah, so we want to really shy away from saying that, like as I said, like the feedback is targeted, right? Like, because, for example, we also compare sham and non-sham conditions, and that doesn't really matter. If you give them fake feedback in the metric that we used, or real feedback, it's really about whether they believe that they're entering this space. I hear you completely about the naturalistic environment about this. Like, there's, in a way, you could argue nothing naturalistic about going into this space together and then, and wearing headsets, et cetera, but people do, after a little while, seem to forget, well, not forget about the interaction, but they do go into like naturalistic interactions. We do think that the feedback can be, like in the case, for example, of having a screen next to you, the two heads merging in and out of each other. That's actually disturbing, right? In a sense, like what are you going to look at? Are you going to look at the screen, or are you going to focus on each other? And so that we just naturally arrived at, like, you have to have it all around you so that you can still look at the person in front of you. But then what happens when it's dark? Then you don't see each other. So then you have to experiment with lights, for example, that people still see each other. So we're really struggling with what mode of feedback might actually be the most natural, both in the way of not distracting like from the actual conversation, or and in the and that it might actually be enhancing. So yeah, I don't have a really good answer to that right now. Like, maybe it has to be haptic. So some people are working with haptic types of feedback, so that I don't know, maybe you receive a snuggle if you're like a haptic thing, that if you're synchronizing. We're playing with sonification. in our installations, that works really well, where people can play, you know, with movement and sounds and visuals. But that's a lot of non-verbal interaction then if you're letting people move around freely. But then people have a really much harder time linking sound to their to Synchrony than linking visuals to Synchrony, right? Like, it's for some reason we're less trained, I guess, to do so, and we see that people create very cacophonous soundscape. Then I'm like, how can you like anyway, yeah, how do you still feel comfortable with this? Like, why do you not stop and try to like synchronize? But they don't. So I don't have a good answer for you.
That was exactly right.
Right? Yeah.
Well, but you mentioned two things that were so perfectly on my mind. While you were speaking, it was great. It was like we were in sync, which is that, you know, in both music performance and in dance, you do actually get some of this feedback. You know, you talked about haptic feedback, and obviously the paper I mentioned by Shrivigny, where they have the dancers holding hands or not. And so you have this haptic contact, which tells you, you know, I'm here, you're here, but also it gives you some indication as to where they're going to move at what speed and so on and so on. So I think, I actually do think that a lot of what you do is ecologically valid. It was just sort of this idea that in some ways you're boosting what might not necessarily always be, you know, available or accessed. So it's something towards also this idea of attention, right? So you might not have it in the focus of your attention at all times. Obviously, when you're a performer, you do more of that, right? You are more aware of a lot of these cues because it's so pertinent to that more kind of precise performance. But you were perfectly on target, perfect, exactly.
I wanted to, if I can say, I know that we're probably on time, but one thing, so what I find very interesting with the dance group is, for example, is that they use, they don't use music as much as their cues as in traditional dance. You might see then, because then you don't have, like, if you have like Tchaikovsky or something, you can just, you know, they know what they need to do. They don't need to have pay attention to each other as much. But in like a lot of modern dance, that's not true. And so they use their breath to focus on. And I feel like, and I've always, and so I think that they were like, as non-dancers, probably using, like, I'm subconsciously using those kinds of cues possibly as well, not as much as in dance, but it's interesting. Anyway, I just wanted to say,
no,
so it's not just
completely agree. And I was going to mention something similar. And in a paper I wrote with Mathieu Galotti and Chris Frith, we talk about the distinction between different forms of dance, tango and salsa, as two opposites in terms of how much of that, you know, that information you actually need and use to coordinate adaptively and reciprocally. But on that note, we're going to change over to our next speaker. Thank you again, Suzanne, for your talk and your time, and for waking up early for us. And your kids didn't make any noise at all, so you can get them like...
They did, but it's good that you didn't hear. Okay.